The sun wasn't even up yet, but the night was. He had been for over an hour, not because he was eager or noble or filled with some divine sense of purpose. He was awake because the cold wouldn't let him sleep. His chamber, if you could call it that, was a stone box with one arrow slit for a window and a pile of straw that scratched worse than chainmail. His breath fogged the air. Rats skittered somewhere in the dark, scratching along the edges of the stone as if searching for a way in. Or a way out. He had a blanket. It smelled like horse, and it didn't cover his feet. Before we go further, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy falling asleep to history as much as I enjoy writing it. Before he could even pull on his leggings, a page boy thumped on the door and shouted that the master-at-arms wanted him in the yard. Again, no good morning, no breakfast. Just another round of steel practice before the frost had even begun to thaw on the training posts. He groaned, rolled his stiff shoulders, and got dressed. Linen, then wool, then padded gambeson. Then came the chainmail, ring by freezing ring, each piece biting into his skin as he strapped it over bruises from the day before. Then the belt, heavy with a sword that felt like it had doubled in weight overnight. All before sunrise. All before his knees stopped aching from the last patrol. Out in the yard, the mud clung to everything. Thick, sticky, and merciless. Last night's rain hadn't dried, and it wouldn't, not with this wind. His boots sank with every step. He couldn't tell if his feet were wet from the mud, or just from his own sweat soaking through the wool. The master-at-arms barked commands with the same rhythm he always did, sharp, brutal, and unforgiving. Boys too young to shave swung wooden swords at each other like madmen. They screamed with every blow, not out of rage, but from the cold biting into their lungs. The knight, seasoned though he was, had no time to rest. Practice was mandatory, always. It didn't matter how many real battles you'd already fought. It didn't matter how many scars you could count across your arms or how many bones you'd cracked back into place with your own fingers. The sword in his hand wasn't a symbol. It was a tool, and tools didn't complain. Breakfast came later if you were lucky. A thick crust of black bread, teeth-breaking and stale. A slab of something that might once have been cheese, now gray around the edges. Watered wine if you were lucky. Warm broth if someone had managed to get the fire going before the wind snuffed it out. He ate standing, leaning on the training dummy, chewing slowly, carefully, as though each bite might crack a molar. He stared at the wall and wondered if this would be the day the Lord sent them out again. There were whispers of bandits in the forest, or maybe it was a group of peasants who refused to pay their taxes. Either way, it would mean saddle sores, rain-soaked cloaks, and sleeping on stones while some squire tried to cook barley mush over a weak fire that wouldn't last past midnight. This was the truth of it. Being a knight wasn't glorious. It wasn't chivalric poems or maiden-filled towers. It was cold. It was bruising. It was endless drills and heavier armor each year. It was being used like a sword yourself, drawn, swung, bloodied, and then hung back up until needed again. And you didn't shine. You rusted, quietly, piece by piece. The night's morning had already been a punishing ordeal, and it was far from over. After forcing down a meal that barely passed as nourishment, a crust of stale bread so hard it might have doubled as a weapon, and a chunk of half-cured meat, more gristle than flesh, he dragged himself to the stables. The sky above remained the color of hammered iron, cold and unforgiving, a bleak ceiling to the dreariness below. The wind, sharp and unrelenting, sliced through every layer of wool and leather he wore like 1,000 icy needles. The stables were no haven either. They reeked of damp hay, festering manure, and mildew-encrusted tack left too long in disrepair. Horses snorted in irritation and shuffled in their stalls, their breath rising in cloudy plumes that vanished into the frozen air like whispers of warmth that would never return. His own warhorse, a towering destrier with flint-colored eyes and a temper only marginally less hostile than a berserker in full charge, shifted restlessly. The beast stamped and snorted as though it too knew what misery the day held in store. The knight crouched, his knees already aching, running calloused hands down each of the animal's legs, feeling for heat or swelling. Satisfied there were no injuries, he moved to the hooves, scraping away impacted muck and straw. Then came the saddle, an unforgiving slab of wood, iron, and stiffened leather designed more for combat survival than comfort. Heaving it onto the horse's back drained what little strength he'd recovered overnight. The girth strap resisted, thick and stiff with age, and it took 3 exhausting attempts to cinch it tight. Next were the weapons. The ritual of strapping on gear had to be done precisely. Lance, sword, dagger, mace, each needed to be placed so they could be reached in a heartbeat, but wouldn't unbalance him or catch during combat. A misplaced buckle, a swinging strap, could mean death. His squires fumbled their assistance, bleary-eyed boys barely old enough to shave, clumsy and red-handed, from the cold. They struggled with the buckles and knots, trying to act as if they belonged here, but their hands trembled and their eyes darted, sleep-deprived and overwhelmed. He said nothing. They would learn, or they would be replaced. Finally mounted, he rode through the muck toward the outer training fields. There, the drills began at first light and ended only when the sun disappeared behind the tree line. Formations were run, broken and reformed with obsessive regularity. Charges practiced until the horses foamed at the bit. Lances angled down, shields locked tight, hooves pounded frozen earth in wave after wave of simulated battle. Every pass was a collision with pain, like being slammed by a smith's hammer. His shoulders burned, his wrists throbbed with every blow, and each clash sent jolts down his spine like lightning strikes. Still, the master-at-arms bellowed without mercy, spitting commands and ridicule in equal measure. He tore into them for sloppy angles, unsteady grips, loose stances, as though an enemy force might come charging over the hill at any moment, which they very well might. By late morning, the knight's body was a battlefield of its own. Muscles twitched involuntarily, and his fingers had gone so numb he wasn't sure if he still held the reins or if his hands simply remembered the motion. Dismounting was a slow descent into pain. Every joint cracked, each movement a grim negotiation. A squire handed him a flask of watered-down wine, and he drank deeply, indifferent to its sourness or temperature. The sun, such as it was, loomed low and gray in the sky, casting a sickly light across churned-up mud that was as thick as bread dough and just as clingy. There would be no reprieve. After the meager midday meal, likely another smear of bland porridge and a hunk of rock-hard cheese that had outlived its flavor, he would return to training, this time with sword and shield. The drills would test every fiber in his arms, every reaction in his weary muscles. After that, he'd be assigned to night watch, posted on the ramparts until the dark hours just before dawn, staring into cold blackness, listening for sounds that weren't supposed to be there. No one cared if he was tired. No one asked if his back screamed, if his knuckles split open from gripping a sword hilt too long. Knights didn't complain. They endured. That was the price of glory, or at least the promise of it. What glory actually meant was blood in your socks, rot in your teeth, and silence in your bed. He stood on the training field, steam rising from his armor like smoke off a forge. His breath fogged the steel edges of his visor, and the mud clung to his boots like cement. His legs felt like carved stone, dead weight moving through ritual. He chuckled under his breath, bitter and low. This was the dream, wasn't it? Glory, brotherhood, honor. What it really meant was bruises in places he couldn't name, wounds that never fully healed, and endless days of preparing for a battle that might never come. This wasn't the stuff of songs. This was the grind, and the sun hadn't even reached its peak. The worst part? He'd do it all again tomorrow. And the day after that. Because quitting wasn't an option. And rest? That was for the dead. Beneath the gleam of polished armor and the romanticized legends sung by minstrels, the actual life of a medieval knight was anything but glamorous. It was a grind of discipline, discomfort, and endless obligation. Long before the sun crept above the horizon, a knight's day would begin. There was no indulgence in sleep, not in a cold, drafty stone keep, where the wind sliced through the walls like knives, and certainly not with the shouts of servants, the creaking of wooden floors, and the rustling of squires already hard at work. His first duty? Prayer. Not optional, not symbolic, a deep daily ritual. A knight was as bound to God as he was to his liege lord. He would kneel in the frigid chapel, lips trembling through Latin prayers, reciting verses to a distant, often silent deity. It was a spiritual armor, a plea for strength in battle, mercy in sin, and hope for a death that came with honor. Then came the ritual of donning armor, a process far more tedious and grueling than the cinematic montages suggest. It took time. It took help. It took patience. The knight stood as his squire assisted him, step by step, linen underclothes to wick away sweat, a thickly padded gambeson to absorb the bite of blows, then the mail, interlinked rings that weighed as much as a child. And if he was wealthy or important enough, plate armor followed, layered, jointed, crushing, each piece strapped tight, each buckle fastened. Gauntlets encased his hands like steel prisons, greaves wrapped his shins, and finally the helmet, a stifling dome that turned breath into mist and made the world feel like it came from underwater. Protection, yes, but freedom? None. Even walking became a negotiation with weight. Once armored, the knight would eat, if he had time. Breakfast wasn't a feast. It was utilitarian, a hunk of stale bread, perhaps hard cheese and a cup of weak ale or watered wine, enough to keep the body from collapsing. That was the point. With food swallowed and muscles barely warm, training began. It didn't matter if it was raining or if wounds from the day before hadn't yet scabbed over. Every day was for drilling, swordsmanship, shield work, jousting, horseback combat, wrestling, archery, hours and hours of sweat and pain. The clang of metal echoed through the courtyard as blades struck wooden dummies and other knights alike. Injuries were constant. A black eye was a mark of effort. A broken rib meant you were trying. Lost teeth, fractured fingers, concussions. These were rites of passage. And over everything, the shadow of war loomed large. A knight was never more than one horn blast or messenger away from being called to arms. When it came, he had to assemble quickly. Armor, weapons, horses, retainers, tents, provisions. Campaigning was not noble or heroic. It was miserable. Endless days marching through muck, sleeping on wet ground, battling illness, hunger, and exposure. When the fighting started, the violence was intimate and terrifying. Men screaming, horses trampling, the smell of blood and sweat and rot. Death came by blade, but also by fever, infected wounds, or simply hunger. So while the songs praised knights for courage and chivalry, and paintings showed them bathed in golden light, the truth was far less poetic. Their lives were rigid, exhausting, and brutal. They bore the crushing weight of duty, on their shoulders, on their conscience, and in every aching joint. The ideal of the knight was a fantasy. The reality was far more punishing. They say chivalry was the code, but for the average knight, the day often began with stiffness, soreness, and the deep groan of regret. That shining suit of armor everyone romanticizes, in practice it was more like a metal tomb. From the moment your squire began the long process of dressing you, layer by layer, buckle by buckle, you were committing to a day of discomfort, weight, and constraint. The chainmail alone could feel like wearing 100 pounds of itching, pinching misery. It scratched at your skin, chafed your neck, and left you sweating before the day had even started. Then came the plate armor, which didn't just look heavy. It was heavy. Your shoulders bore the burden, and even the act of breathing took more effort than it should have. And God help you if you hadn't eaten first, because going to the privy in full armor was a logistical nightmare, awkward, humiliating, and often ignored in heroic tales for good reason. Training was no better. Romantic duels and stories of battlefield prowess made it seem elegant, but reality told a different story. Sword drills weren't graceful dances. They were grueling, sweaty punishments under the burning sun. You'd train until your limbs felt like stone. Wooden practice swords? Still capable of breaking ribs or fingers? Blunted steel weapons? They left bruises that turned every joint into a reminder of yesterday's failure. Your trainer? Probably a scarred, joyless veteran who screamed more than he spoke, barking out orders with a voice like gravel. You'd run laps in full chainmail, swing weapons until your hands blistered, and practice falling again and again. Because the first time someone knocked you off your horse in real combat, you needed to survive long enough to get back up. And let's not forget the horse. War horses weren't just big. They were muscular tanks with attitudes. Caring for them was practically its own career. They needed to be groomed daily, fed carefully, exercised constantly, and trained meticulously. If your squire didn't keep up with this work, you'd find out the hard way, usually by getting bucked, bitten, or trampled. A badly trained horse was as deadly as a blade, and despite all the work, bonding with the animal wasn't guaranteed. Some knights managed to build a partnership that bordered on sacred. Others were stuck with beasts that seemed to loathe them. Either way, you had to trust that creature with your life every time you rode into battle. The glamour of being a knight? It was mostly illusion. Beneath the shining surface was a daily cycle of pain, pressure, and preparation. For every moment of praise or honor, there were weeks of brutal effort, quiet suffering, and the lingering sting of wounds that never quite healed. The glory was real, yes, but so was the misery, and that part rarely made it into the ballads. By the time dawn broke over the grassy fields of medieval England, a knight's day had already begun, often before the sun even crested the horizon. Contrary to the romantic image of noble warriors lounging in silken sheets beneath stained glass windows in serene castle chambers, most knights awoke in stark, stone-walled rooms chilled by the damp morning air. Their beds were firm pallets stuffed with straw, covered with scratchy woolen blankets rather than velvet finery. And their first act of the day wasn't grabbing a sword or charging off to battle. It was dealing with a long list of mundane and frustrating tasks that had nothing to do with glory. Servants might be present to assist in dressing, but that didn't make the process quick or pleasant. Dressing for the day was an ordeal. First came the linen undergarments to protect the skin, then a thick, quilted gambeson to absorb blows and prevent bruising. On top of that came a heavy shirt of mail or increasingly common plate armor, each section needing careful lacing, buckling, and fitting. Putting on a full suit of armor could take more than an hour, especially if one had to ensure it was properly adjusted and wouldn't rub raw against the skin during long hours in the saddle. The armor had to be polished regularly to prevent rust, inspected for dents, and repaired constantly. It was both expensive and exhausting. Breakfast was a far cry from the overflowing banquet tables seen in movies. Most mornings, knights ate a meager meal, stale bread dipped in broth, a mug of weak ale, and if fortune smiled, a slice of salted meat. These meals were about fuel, not flavor. Knights required calories to keep going, but there was little luxury in what they ate day to day. The bulk of their diet was rough and repetitive, geared toward endurance rather than enjoyment. Once fed, the day shifted from drudgery to duty. Knights, especially those of modest means, were more than warriors. They were expected to manage the land granted to them by their liege lord. This meant overseeing serfs in the fields, ensuring taxes were collected, mediating property disputes, and even settling personal quarrels between peasants. As minor nobles and local enforcers of feudal law, They served as judges, landlords, tacksmen, and peacekeepers. Paperwork, parchment, and ledgers were often more familiar to them than lances or swords. Chivalry might have been a lofty ideal, but in reality, it translated to an exhausting blend of bureaucratic, political, and social responsibility. If there was time for training, it came as a break from the monotony. But training was far from glamorous. There were no moonlit duels or elegant displays of swordsmanship. It was brutal, repetitive, and physically punishing. Knights trained with blunted weapons and heavy wooden shields, often wearing thick practice armor that added unnecessary weight. Sessions were long, sweaty, and injury-prone. Bruises were constant companions, and pulled muscles or dislocated joints weren't uncommon. Yet this training was essential. A knight could go years without seeing real battle, but the expectation was to be ready at a moment's notice. Tournaments, those bright spectacles of jousting and skill, were rare, expensive, and dangerous. For most knights, they were too risky to be worth the cost. In truth, the battlefield was often political. Knights navigated feuds between neighbors, pleaded their case in front of lords, and tried to keep peace in tense times. Their real fights were with stubborn tenants, overworked scribes, and the expectations of their overlords. Forget dragons or damsels. The reality of knighthood was often a thankless grind. Far from being mythical heroes, knights were more like overburdened managers, juggling military preparedness with tedious domestic duties. The work never seemed to end. The glamour was elusive, and the weight of armor, responsibility, and legacy never really left their shoulders. The knight's day was far from a romantic tale of gallant charges and shining valor. By the time the sun had barely lifted itself over the horizon, casting long shadows across damp grass, the knight was already several tasks deep into an exhausting routine. The idyllic image of a knight at rest simply didn't exist. Every piece of gear had to be accounted for. Armor didn't polish itself, and though squires offered help, they were often clumsy or inexperienced. The knight, determined to maintain readiness, had to inspect each plate and chain link personally. Rain, sweat, blood, and grime were constant enemies of steel. Every morning, without fail, began in the armory, where he hunched over his gear, cloth in hand, sleeves rolled up, rubbing oil into the metal like a craftsman desperate to keep rust from stealing his life. The sword, more than a symbol, was a survival tool. It had to be sharpened with care, balanced for speed, and cleaned after every use. The helmet, heavy and suffocating, needed its leather straps checked, its interior padded, and adjusted to avoid crushing the skull during a charge. A knight who neglected his equipment didn't last long. There was no glory in dying because your visor jammed shut. Next came the horse, the war horse, bred for strength and trained for chaos. These animals weren't ordinary farm beasts. They were living machines of war, and like machines, they needed constant tuning. The knight checked for cracked hooves, sore muscles, loose tack, and dirty stables. Grooming was essential. Feeding was strategic. A sick horse could mean death on the battlefield. A spooked one could break formation. Every saddle strap was tested, every bit cleaned. It wasn't affection. It was survival. And then there was training. Constant, brutal training. Even on days when no campaign loomed, the knight trained as though battle was waiting just beyond the walls. Sword drills against dummies and sparring partners. Jousting runs at full speed. Long hours in chainmail, practicing swings until the arm ached and the fingers went numb. The training yard was never silent. Grunts, shouts, steel clashing on steel, and groans of pain formed the daily soundtrack. Bruises weren't occasional, they were permanent. Bloodied noses, cracked ribs, and dislocated joints were all just part of getting better, or staying alive. But swinging a sword wasn't all that occupied a knight. There was governance. Being a knight meant managing land, attending councils, and serving a lord. The knight might have to deal with tax records, resolve land disputes, oversee serfs, and ensure local laws were obeyed. If the mill was broken, if the blacksmith lacked coal, or if the granaries were low, someone needed to fix it, and usually that someone was him. Diplomacy was required. So was intimidation, and sometimes raw force. A knight didn't just fight armies, he also fought chaos on his estate. By the time night crept in, there was rarely energy for celebration. Meals were humble, dense bread, tough salted meat, boiled roots, and weak wine. Feasts were rare, and even during those, the knight was expected to be presentable, obedient, and alert. There were no lazy evenings, no lengthy banter by the fire, just quiet nods between weary men, and if conversation happened, it was often short, practical, or laced with the fatigue of repetition. Sleep, when it came, was no luxury. It was brief, shallow, and constantly interrupted by thoughts of missed training, looming threats, or the next inspection. The cot was hard, the blankets rough. Even in slumber, the knight remained half aware, ears tuned for sudden alarms. There were no dreams of glory, just exhaustion dragging the body down like armor in water. So, despite what the songs and scrolls might suggest, the life of a knight was no tale of unending triumph. It was a job of unrelenting work, physical wear, and mental pressure. Banners might wave and trumpets might sound, but beneath the gleam of the armor was a body bruised, a mind burdened, and a man surviving one grueling day at a time. In the fading orange light of the castle courtyard, the knight dismounts after another long, brutal patrol that's left his entire body screaming with fatigue. His armor, which once gleamed proudly under banners and sun, is now streaked with crusted mud, dried sweat, and faint bloodstains. The squire scurries over to take his horse, but there's no pageantry, no roar of applause, just the sound of aching joints, the crunch of boots on gravel, and a heavy silence. His chainmail clinks and grinds with every labored step, the iron biting into muscles already worn thin. Beneath it, his linen tunic is soaked and clinging to his skin, chafing against raw welts. A rash has begun to form around his neck, red and angry, where the metal has rubbed relentlessly. There are no ballads sung about that. Inside the keep, he begins the painstaking process of stripping off his gear, piece by piece, each movement a silent act of endurance. Gauntlets, greaves, cuirass, coif, each removed like shedding layers of misery. His fingers tremble as he unlatches the straps, joints stiff from cold and overuse. There's no chambermaid to help him, no roaring fire or steaming bath to ease his bones, just a small basin of icy water in a dim corner, and a rag that's rough enough to scrape. He washes what he can, wiping away the grime, the blood, and the stink of the road. He glances up at a warped bronze mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. The face staring back at him is hollow-eyed and gaunt, weathered by wind and time, a split lip still crusted from a tavern brawl 2 nights ago. He mutters something, a prayer, a curse, maybe both, as he turns away. There's no rest for someone chained to duty. Dinner is served without ceremony. A slab of bread so hard he could chip a tooth, a bowl of boiled turnips gray with overcooking, and a cup of ale flat and sour with age. The lord of the castle doesn't share meals with his knights. They eat among themselves on splintered benches beneath soot-darkened beams, surrounded by others just as battered and joyless. There's no music, no chatter, just the sound of chewing, a grunt here and there, and eyes that lift only when the heavy door creaks open, always expecting orders or bad news, or worse, the call to arms again. And when the knight finally drags himself to the crude, straw-stuffed pallet that passes for a bed, the sharp smell of mildew and damp earth rises immediately to greet him. The mattress sags beneath his weight. The blanket is thin, the wind from the cracks in the stone wall sharp as knives. Sleep does not come easy. Not with the bruises from training, not with the dull throb in his shoulder from a mishandled shield blow, and certainly not with the memories clawing behind his eyelids. Things he did in the name of duty, of honor, of survival. Outside, a storm gathers strength, wind howling through the high towers and whispering through arrow slits. Thunder growls like some distant beast. He pulls the scratchy wool blanket tighter and stares at the ceiling. This is knighthood, not dragons, not glory. No shining legends or poetic honor. Just a man trapped in steel, burdened by expectation, grinding out each day in silence and slowly being forgotten by the world he swore to protect. No song will ever capture the weight of it. Not really. At first light, a knight's day began not with gallant quests, but with the clatter of servants and the stiffness of aching limbs. Unlike the fantasy of waking in sunlit chambers to the sounds of lutes, real medieval mornings often meant rising from a straw-filled mattress in a drafty stone chamber, wrapped in coarse linen sheets that did little to hold back the chill. There was no sleeping in. Nobles were expected to start their days early, and knights were no exception. Once upright, the process of simply getting dressed could feel like a military operation. First came layers of underclothes, a linen shirt, padded leggings, a thick gambeson. Then, depending on the task ahead, a knight might don a hauberk of chainmail or pieces of plate armor. None of it was comfortable. Chainmail bit into the shoulders, pinched skin, and required strength just to move in. And that was assuming you didn't need help putting it all on, which you usually did. Breakfast was simple. Black bread, maybe some cheese, and a weak ale. Forget silver platters and decadent meals. Those were for feast days. A knight's regular breakfast was more about fuel than flavor. Meals were brief, and conversation at the morning table was often curt, if not silent. What followed was rarely glorious. A knight's life was less about sword-swinging adventures, and more about estate management, overseeing crops and livestock, hearing disputes among peasants, settling debts, and keeping the lord's property functioning. Think of it as a mix between farm manager, part-time cop, and middle-tier bureaucrat. It was exhausting and relentless. There was no time to dream of dragons or damsels. There were roofs leaking, serfs petitioning for mercy, and animals to be tended. Even the physical side of being a knight, the training and preparation for war, was brutal and unforgiving. Sword drills, jousting practice, and horsemanship were all physically grueling. Armor was heavy and cumbersome, and riding for hours in full gear left many bruised, sore, and often injured. Add to this the constant risk of infection from even minor wounds. Remember, there was no real medical care, and it became clear that valor often came at the cost of chronic pain. And all of this was done under the looming pressure of expectation. Knights were meant to uphold a code, to be strong, wise, just, and brave. But what if you weren't? What if you were tired, afraid, or simply not up to the task? In those cases, there was no room for confession. Failure wasn't just personal, it was dishonorable. So many knights buried their fatigue, their doubts, and their suffering beneath a polished breastplate and a silent grimace. So while legends tell of honor and heroism, the reality of a knight's daily life was far more taxing. Early mornings, heavy burdens, endless responsibilities, and the gnawing awareness that one misstep, on the battlefield or at court, could lead to disgrace or death. In the early hours of the morning, long before the sun had even begun to climb over the ramparts of the castle, a knight's day started not with glory, but with quiet discomfort. There were no cheering crowds, no ceremonial horns to mark the dawn. Instead, there was only the hard chill of the stone floor, the echo of his own footsteps in the dim corridors, and the looming presence of iron and leather waiting to be hauled onto a tired body. Before he touched a sword or mounted a horse, a knight had to bow his head, not to a king, but to God. Prayer was the first duty. A knight was bound by oath to be a servant of the divine, to humble himself before the heavens, confess every sin, and plead for the strength to face the day. This wasn't a private moment of reflection. It was a drilled-in ritual, enforced since boyhood during the brutal discipline of page and squire training. Once the prayers were done, the real weight of knighthood settled in. Armor didn't polish itself, and swords didn't stay sharp just by existing. If a knight didn't have a squire, and not all did, he had to tend to his gear personally. Every morning was a cycle of maintenance, oiling chainmail, mending broken rings, inspecting dents in the helmet, checking for rust, sharpening blades, tightening straps. Leather harnesses cracked over time, and worn-out fittings could spell death on the battlefield. There was no glamour in this. The shining knight of courtly tales was a myth. These men were warriors, yes, but they were also overworked, underfed, and chronically sore. Then came training. Sword drills on packed dirt, lance practice on splintering dummies, hours of horseback riding that blistered the inner thighs and calloused the hands. A knight couldn't afford to let his edge dull, not even for a day. There were no rest days, no padded arenas or safety gear. Training was brutal, because war was worse. And when injuries happened, and they did often, there were no doctors in the modern sense. A broken limb might heal wrong, a deep gash could fester. Pain wasn't an obstacle, it was a permanent part of life. Meals were rarely a comfort. On campaign, food was rations, hard bread, dried meat, maybe some lentils if luck held. At home it was slightly better, but still modest. A crust of bread, a hunk of salt-cured pork, and water or weak ale to wash it down. Cheese and fruits were rare luxuries. The image of the well-fed, feasting knight was reserved for lords and kings. Most knights were middle-tier fighters, prestigious in name, but often poor in comfort. And when war came, comforts vanished entirely. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion were as much a threat as enemy swords. The stories, the epics of valor and honor, of noble hearts and chivalrous quests, left out almost everything. They didn't mention the cold that sank into the bones, the days spent ankle-deep in mud, the sleep interrupted by freezing winds or aching joints. They didn't sing of the loneliness, of the fear before battle, or the grief of watching comrades fall. Real knighthood wasn't a tale for children. It was a hard, grinding life built on duty, pain, and repetition. No one celebrated your return unless you returned with something worth celebrating. And even then, you were expected to be ready again by morning. If a knight was lucky, truly lucky, he lived long enough to grow old in his armor, to feel the weight of years pressing down heavier than any sword or shield. And if not, his name would be carved into stone and forgotten just as easily. If you think being a knight meant days filled with glory, honor, and shining armor, think again. The popular image of a valiant warrior charging into battle in gleaming plate, adored by the people and honored at royal courts, is more fantasy than fact. By the time most squires reached knighthood, their bodies were already worn down from years, sometimes more than a decade, of punishing training. Grueling drills, weapon practice, and serving their lord's every command turned young boys into hardened men long before they ever held a title. And once they earned the coveted rank, what followed wasn't prestige. It was a lifetime of exhaustion, violence, and often poverty. A typical day began well before sunrise. Knights didn't rise early out of chivalrous discipline. They did so out of necessity. Their daily responsibilities were relentless and rarely glorious. Aside from military obligations, they had to manage estates, settle disputes, oversee serfs, and collect taxes. And no, most weren't cushioned nobles lounging in castle halls. The majority were minor lords or landless mercenaries, tasked with enforcing their liege's will across harsh terrain and dealing with the most unpleasant duties, evicting tenants, quashing local rebellions, or acting as brutal enforcers in noble feuds. The job was political as much as it was physical, and every decision had the potential to make new enemies. The armor that we romanticize today was anything but glamorous to wear. A full suit of mail or plate armor could weigh anywhere from 40 to 60 pounds, and wearing it felt like being locked in a boiling metal shell. It wasn't just heavy, it was punishing. Beneath the steel was a layer of padded clothing, which trapped heat and sweat. The joints creaked with every movement, and knights often needed assistance just to get dressed or mount a horse. Armor was not worn all day. It was reserved for battle or travel, but hauling it from place to place was exhausting in itself. And then there was the maintenance. Armor required constant cleaning and oiling to prevent rust. Dents and cracks had to be repaired, often at great cost. Let your equipment fall into disrepair, and you might as well dig your own grave. When not fighting in organized campaigns, knights were frequently drawn into private skirmishes and petty wars between rival nobles. These weren't glorious, banner-waving affairs. They were messy, dangerous, and deeply political. Allegiances changed like the wind, and one wrong move, supporting the wrong faction, refusing a duel, or being accused of cowardice, could ruin a knight's reputation or even cost his life. Political maneuvering and court intrigue weren't limited to kings and queens. Even low-ranking knights were subject to betrayal, manipulation, and endless tension. Loyalty was a currency, and it was spent ruthlessly. And let's talk about hygiene, or the lack of it. Medieval understanding of cleanliness was rudimentary at best. Knights lived in close quarters with their men, their horses, and their gear. Sweat-soaked armor rubbed skin raw. Lice, fleas, and infections were constant companions. Hot baths were a rare luxury, not a routine habit. The smell of a night on campaign was more likely to make someone faint than swoon. The picturesque image of a gleaming hero atop a snow-white stallion. More often, it was a worn-out man on a mud-caked, half-starved horse, returning from some grim task with blood on his surcoat and mud in his boots. Then there was the so-called code of chivalry, often portrayed as a noble set of guiding principles: honor, courtesy, bravery, and justice. In truth, it was more of a marketing scheme. The code was an ideal, rarely upheld in the brutal reality of feudal life. Knights could be ruthless extortionists, looters, and mercenaries hired out to the highest bidder. They laid waste to villages, stole from peasants, and enforced orders with a sword's edge. Compassion was a liability. Mercy was a weakness. Chivalry may have been praised in songs, but on the ground it was often just another word for obey your master and do as you're told. So while bards and poets spun tales of noble warriors and courtly honor, the truth was much grimmer. The real knights lived hard, dangerous, and unforgiving lives. For every ceremonial joust or feast, there were years of back-breaking labor, sleepless nights, and the ever-present fear that they'd die far from home with nothing to show for it. Glory wasn't just rare, it was mostly an illusion. And behind the legend was a man, worn down by the armor, the politics, the violence, and the burden of duty he could never put down. By the time a knight reached midday, the physical demands of his station had already begun to grind him down. But the challenges didn't end with the clang of swords or the crushing weight of armor. Beyond the battlefield, another exhausting expectation loomed large in a knight's daily life: the relentless maintenance of his weapons, armor, and overall appearance. A knight wasn't merely a fighter, he was a living emblem of status, loyalty, and nobility. That image carried a heavy price. Keeping armor battle-ready wasn't a task completed once a week and forgotten. It was a daily, painstaking ritual. Chainmail, made of hundreds of interlocking metal rings, rusted easily if not constantly cleaned and meticulously oiled. Plate armor, while sturdier, dented and scratched with every hard ride or sparring session. Every piece, from gauntlet to greave, needed hours of polishing to gleam as expected. And although popular imagination paints squires as ever-ready helpers, the burden didn't rest entirely on their shoulders. A squire could assist, yes, but ultimately the knight himself bore the responsibility of ensuring that his gear was flawless. A sword left dull could snap in combat. A helmet with a bent visor could obstruct vision, or worse, invite a fatal blow. The daily upkeep wasn't about vanity. It was a question of life or death. Then there were the inspections. At tournaments, public ceremonies, or courtly gatherings, Knights were expected to appear in pristine condition, gleaming armor, razor-sharp weapons, and heraldry so crisp it could be seen from across a field. Every crest, every color, every detail had to be perfectly aligned and instantly recognizable. Appearance was more than ceremonial. It was directly tied to a knight's reputation and honor. To arrive in a tarnished cuirass or with an unkempt appearance wasn't just bad form. It was disgraceful. And disgrace had real consequences. Rumors would spread like wildfire. Mockery would follow, and the knights standing among peers and future prospects could be irreparably harmed. The burden of image extended even further. Nobles, barons, and lords often expected their knights to double as diplomats, ceremonial guards, and household representatives at various events. This required dressing to impress, speaking with grace, and carrying oneself with both dignity and humility. Any slip-up, whether in etiquette, speech, or appearance, could sour political alliances or tarnish a lord's reputation. In that sense, the game of courtly appearances could be more treacherous than the battlefield. Navigating these social demands was a constant, invisible duel. Even mealtime offered no true respite. Feasts and banquets were elaborate performances in their own right. Knights had to exhibit impeccable manners, eat with deliberate restraint, and drink in moderation. Overindulgence was frowned upon, and small talk was a battlefield of its own, demanding tact, diplomacy, and wit. Conversations with nobles had to be respectful, engaging, and politically astute. Every word, every gesture was scrutinized. It wasn't enough to be a fierce warrior. You also had to be cultured, charismatic, and endlessly composed, even when your muscles ached and your armor had barely come off. So while stories of knights often center on glory, heroism, and honor, the reality was far more grueling. Midday marked not a pause but a pivot. From physical strain to social and symbolic labor, there was no downtime in a knight's world, only a relentless cycle of different kinds of toil. Each demanded precision, endurance, and the unshakable ability to wear the mask of nobility, no matter what pains lay beneath. For a knight, the battlefield was only one kind of trial. Off the field, there was another kind of pressure entirely, the relentless, unyielding demand to live by the code of chivalry. To outsiders, this code might seem noble, a blend of honor, loyalty, religious piety, and martial excellence. But, in reality, it was an exhausting, rigid, and suffocating script that governed every word, gesture, and decision a knight made, from dawn until long after sunset. From the moment he opened his eyes each morning, a knight was expected to embody an impossible ideal. Strong, yet humble. Fearsome in combat, yet merciful to defeated foes. Obedient to his lord, yet unwaveringly protective of the poor, the weak, and the innocent. It wasn't just about winning battles. It was about performing a perfect, heroic identity every waking hour. Any deviation from this elaborate standard could tarnish a knight's name permanently. Did he show too much cruelty in war? He was labeled a savage. Did he show too much mercy? He was weak, soft, perhaps even cowardly. If he lost his temper in court, it was called dishonor. If he remained too silent, he was accused of arrogance or deceit. There was no safe middle ground. A knight was watched constantly, not only by fellow nobles and lords, but by squires, servants, clergy, townspeople, even peasants. Eyes were always on him, judging him. Rumors could slice through his reputation faster than any sword. And in this world, a man's honor was everything. A whispered accusation, cowardice, treason, heresy, could be all it took to lose one's title, fortune, or head. Then came the spiritual burden, perhaps the heaviest weight of all. Knights were supposed to be paragons of Christian virtue, holy warriors of faith, champions of the church. They were expected to kill without hesitation, yet pray without pride. After slaughtering dozens in a battle, they were supposed to kneel at the altar, bow their heads, and seek forgiveness. They were meant to believe that fighting and dying in a holy war, like a crusade, would redeem their souls. But deep inside, many struggled with what they had done and what they had become. Confessors and priests heard sins soaked in blood and silence. Some knights went on pilgrimages, desperate to cleanse their souls. Others threw themselves into war after war, hoping that dying for a holy cause might finally silence the guilt that gnawed at them night after night. The truth was, being a knight wasn't just physically demanding. It was psychologically crushing. You weren't allowed to simply be a man. You had to be a flawless symbol of duty, of loyalty, of piety, of courage. You were expected to uphold an image so polished and grand that your own humanity had to be buried beneath it. In a world that never let you forget the weight of your role, the armor you wore did more than protect your flesh from swords. It served as a shell to hide the parts of you that didn't fit the myth. And sometimes, that armor became a prison, one you never took off, even in sleep. Before the fighting, before the banners and fleeting glory, there was the burden of armor, a crushing, inescapable reality. Not just the concept of it, but the literal, brutal weight that wrapped every inch of a knight's body. For a medieval knight, suiting up wasn't just routine, it was a full-blown operation. The chainmail alone could weigh over 40 pounds, sagging over the shoulders and dragging with every step. Then came the layers: a padded gambeson, a surcoat, metal greaves, gauntlets, a breastplate, and finally, the helmet. Altogether, a knight moved through the world with the equivalent of a full-grown child strapped to their body, on every limb, every joint. It wasn't ceremonial, it wasn't symbolic, it was exhausting, day in and day out. Knights didn't walk around in full armor constantly, but when they did, during battle, in training, on patrol, or at tournaments, it was pure punishment. The heat was relentless. Inside the helmet, the air turned thick and sour, like breathing inside an oven. Vision narrowed to thin slits, turning peripheral sight into guesswork. Hearing? Muffled by layers of metal and padding. Every breath drawn through those metal grills was hot, shallow, and struggled. Now picture doing all that while trying to fight, sprint across a field, or hold your balance atop a charging horse. Which brings us to the horses. Yes, destriers were strong, trained, and expensive. But riding one while wearing 100 pounds of metal wasn't comfortable. Mounting alone was a challenge, often requiring help from a squire or stable hand. A mounting block was essential, or else a knight risked falling before the battle even began. Once up there, riding wasn't smooth or graceful. Every lurch and jolt from the horse rattled through the armor, bruising the body, chafing the skin, and exhausting the rider. Staying balanced demanded constant muscle tension, core strength, and focus. And then came the sweat, a suffocating, relentless sweat. Armor trapped every ounce of body heat. There was no airflow, no cooling, and no escape. Knights emerged from battle soaked through their padded underlayers, their skin raw from friction. Chafing wounds became open sores. Infections from trapped bacteria and sweat were common. Heat exhaustion loomed constantly, especially in warmer climates or summer campaigns. Dehydration could set in quickly, and some knights collapsed not from wounds, but from the toll of just wearing their gear too long. We often see armor polished to a mirror shine in films, but that was a luxury and a rarity. Keeping it clean and rust-free was an endless chore. Rain, sweat, even dew could kickstart the rusting process overnight. And rust wasn't just ugly, it was dangerous. It weakened the structural integrity of the metal, making a breastplate or helmet more likely to crack under a sword blow. Daily, knights or their overworked squires would spend hours scrubbing, oiling, and maintaining every single link and joint to ensure the armor stayed usable. The image of a knight gallantly charging into battle blade raised and cape fluttering as a fantasy. The truth was far less romantic. Real knights lumbered. They sweated. They suffered in silence beneath their suits of armor, enduring the agony in exchange for the brief, brutal moments when they would clash on the field. What looked like unshakable strength was often just immense discomfort, masked by discipline and duty. Being a knight wasn't just hard. It was a physically punishing, high-maintenance existence, one heavy step at a time. Despite the polished armor and tales of glory, one of the grimmest, most unsettling realities of being a knight was the violence itself. Not just the looming threat of it, but the constant, suffocating, up-close intimacy with it. To be a knight wasn't to chase adventure. It was to be permanently entangled in the blood and chaos of war. You didn't just swing a sword and ride away into a sunset. You heard the bones crack. You felt warm blood on your face. You watched the light dim in a man's eyes as he bled out at your feet. And whether you wanted it to or not, that stayed with you. It buried itself into your mind and made a home there. Combat was not the elegant, slow-motion choreography we see on screen today. It was a frantic, filthy mess, a slog through mud and screams and body parts. When knights clashed, whether in open battle, skirmishes, ambushes, or sieges, they did so in suffocating layers of armor, fighting for hours in brutal conditions. Chainmail alone could weigh 40 pounds. Plate armor added even more, not to mention the shield, sword, dagger, and often a secondary weapon. Now imagine being encased in all that steel, baking under the sun, or drowning in cold rain, soaked in sweat, with mud up to your knees, and men trying to carve you open the entire time. That was the daily reality. And then there were the wounds. Knights didn't just risk death, they lived with disfigurement. A sword slashing open your cheek, a mace caving in your rib cage, a crossbow bolt embedded in your thigh. These were common injuries. Surviving battle didn't mean you were fine. It often meant living with agony. Medical care was primitive. If you were fortunate enough to get any, you were likely to be treated with cauterization, essentially searing your wounds shut with burning metal, or you'd be wrapped in herbs that might soothe or kill you. No one knew the difference. There were no antibiotics, no anesthesia, and certainly no concept of sterilization. Surgery was guesswork. Recovery, if it happened, was slow and brutal. Many died not from the fight, but from infection days later. But the sword didn't stay sheathed just because the war was over. Outside the battlefield, violence was a tool of governance. Knights weren't just warriors. They were law enforcers, tax collectors, and brutal suppressors of rebellion. They were sent to crush peasant uprisings, to drag debtors from their homes, to execute criminals in public squares. Sometimes it meant burning down entire villages to make a point. Sometimes it meant watching a hanging and calling it justice. A few knights performed these duties with loyalty and pride. Many drank to forget. Some became cold and numb. Others didn't mind at all. The chivalric code, that famous notion of honor, loyalty, and gallantry, was more fantasy than fact. It was an ideal, not a reality. Yes, some knights tried to live by it, but most didn't. In practice, knights were feared more than revered. To the peasants who lived under their boots, they weren't noble protectors. They were heavily armored landlords who could end a life without consequence. The romantic knight is a product of poetry, not of peasant memory. So, when we look back at the medieval age, it's tempting to romanticize the pageantry. The grand tournaments, the banners fluttering over high towers, the courtly love and poetic gestures. But beneath that glittering facade lies a much uglier truth. Being a knight meant living with violence, giving it, surviving it, and carrying the scars forever. It meant enduring chronic pain, moral injury, and emotional numbness. It meant living in a world where death was just a swing away, and where glory rarely felt like anything more than survival. By the time a knight reached middle age, the fantasy had usually worn painfully thin. The glamour of jousts, the grandeur of shining armor, and the illusion of courtly love gave way to aching joints, diminished strength, and the unrelenting weight of accumulated scars, both physical and emotional. Years spent bearing the heavy burden of chainmail and plate armor took a brutal toll on the human body. Knees became unreliable, backs seized with pain, and old wounds rarely healed without complication. Arthritis set in early. Some knights limped permanently. Others had lost fingers in duels or siege warfare, and many bore the marks of deep lacerations across their torsos, thighs, or scalps. Few reached old age without some physical reminder of their years on the battlefield. A crooked gait, partial blindness, chronic pain, or a hollow cough from breathing in smoke and dust. And yet, even as their bodies betrayed them, knights were still expected to stand proud, speak with grace, and live by the rigid decorum of chivalry. Readiness for war remained a requirement, even when the sword hand shook and the armor no longer fit like it once had. Life didn't ease with rising rank or prestige. In many respects, it became more burdensome. A seasoned knight often found himself responsible not only for his own survival, but for shaping the lives of younger squires, overseeing estates and peasantry if he held land, and maintaining his place within the labyrinthine politics of noble courts. Training young pages and squires demanded patience and physical exertion. Managing land involved negotiations, disputes, taxes, and grain tallies. Court life was no less dangerous than a battlefield. It required constant awareness, flattery, and strategic maneuvering. A misplaced word, an insult to the wrong noble, or a poorly chosen political alliance could lead to exile, disgrace, or death. Duties multiplied. A knight was expected to attend lengthy feasts, administer justice in petty squabbles, lead raids on neighboring barons when called, or escort noble caravans, all while maintaining an image of unwavering composure and loyalty. They had become more than warriors. They were lawmen, landlords, bodyguards, and pawns in a never-ending game of power. Then came the church. The church's grasp on a knight's life tightened as he aged. Religious doctrine offered no escape, only guilt and the long shadow of judgment. The spiritual burden of a lifetime spent in warfare weighed heavily on those who had killed in the name of kings, lords, and Christendom. For many knights, the later years brought an urgent desire to repent, to wash away the blood and sin. Some joined monastic military orders like the Knights Hospitaller or Templars in search of spiritual redemption. Others undertook pilgrimages across Europe, dragging their tired and wounded bodies over mountains and through forests to reach Rome, Santiago, or Jerusalem. But even these acts of penance were closely observed and often performed under the eyes of others. Appearances mattered. One had to be seen as pious, as devoted, as morally exemplary, even when privately tormented by doubt, fear, or shame. Inner peace was elusive. The rituals of prayer echoed through cold chapels and stone corridors, but true absolution often felt distant. The church offered rules and rites, but rarely comfort. For a knight nearing the end of his service, death itself was not necessarily the greatest fear, but the manner in which it arrived certainly was. The romanticized death on the battlefield, surrounded by comrades and bathed in glory, was a rare occurrence. More commonly, knights died alone in cold beds, their bodies ravaged by infection, fever, or the slow collapse of age. Their once glorious legacies faded quickly. Chroniclers and bards often glorified their exploits, but rarely did they recount the ignoble end, the ulcerated legs, the festering wounds, or the slow erosion of dignity. The stories passed down were written by scribes who never held a sword or smelled the iron of blood. And, as a knight slipped from memory, his actual life was overwritten by embellished tales of valor. Despite years of sacrifice, he was expected to bear his final decline with dignity, to smile through pain, to stand tall though every bone ached. The illusion of honor, the spectacle of knighthood, demanded it. But beneath the steel and ceremony was a man, tired, scarred, and weighed down by the brutal price of the role he had been forced to uphold. The battlefield was only part of a knight's grim reality. What followed the clash of steel and cries of war was often just as brutal, and in many ways, even more punishing. After a fight, regardless of victory, a knight didn't return to peaceful respite, luxurious halls, or joyful celebration. Instead, he found himself back in a filthy, chaotic camp that reeked of blood, sweat, mud, rot, and the heavy stench of unwashed bodies and damp leather. The air was choked with moans and cries from the wounded, men writhing on the ground, screaming for mercy, their flesh torn and mangled, many succumbing slowly to fever, sepsis, or shock. It wasn't a place of rest. It was a purgatory of pain. For the knight himself, if he'd taken injury, relief was scarce and crude. Treatment was primitive at best. Gaping wounds stitched with coarse thread and no anesthetic, often cauterized with glowing hot iron to stop the bleeding. Amputations were done with knives and saws, no more ceremony than gutting a fish. Lesser injuries were wrapped in filthy cloth and left to fester. If he survived, recovery dragged on for weeks or months, leaving behind twisted limbs, disfigured faces, and the ever-present ache of damage done. Then came the relentless burden of honor. Medieval warfare wasn't only about hacking down foes. It was theater, a public test of reputation, courage, and unwavering loyalty. A knight who faltered, who panicked or strayed from the rigid code of chivalry, might survive the battle only to find himself condemned in peace. He would return to court a marked man, a target of sneers, gossip, and shame. Rumors spread like wildfire, and a once proud warrior might find himself mocked in tavern ballads, abandoned by patrons, and avoided in the halls of nobility. Honor lost was rarely forgiven. To reclaim it, knights sometimes undertook humiliating public penance, walking barefoot through villages, fasting, surrendering their lands or wealth to the church, or embarking on grueling pilgrimages across dangerous terrain. The journey to redemption was slow, uncertain, and often fatal. The so-called spoils of war added another layer of hardship and moral rot. If a knight fought on the winning side, he might take prisoners, other knights who could be ransomed back to their lords or wealthy families. But even this was fraught with risk. Ransom negotiations were delicate, tense affairs, demand too high, and you insulted powerful houses, inviting retaliation or eternal enmity. Demand too little, and you were mocked for incompetence or greed. And beyond ransom, there was the grim ritual of looting, stripping corpses of armor, weapons, coins, horses, even boots. The church condemned it, and nobles pretended to scorn it. But in truth, it was survival. A knight's lifestyle was expensive. Armor, horses, squires, and servants didn't pay for themselves. Deep in debt and desperate, many turned a blind eye to the practice. Some even encouraged it. And if your side lost, the outcome could be even more harrowing. Captured knights were sometimes ransomed, yes, but others were tossed into dungeon cells, left to rot in darkness, forgotten by the very nobles and monarchs they had sworn to protect. Some were executed on the spot, especially if they were known, hated, or politically inconvenient. Back home, their families were thrown into turmoil, scrambling to raise coin, sell land, or call in desperate favors to secure release, if release was even possible. Some knights spent years, even decades, in foreign prisons, aging in chains until they returned home as pale, broken shadows of themselves, if they returned at all. Those lucky enough to survive and return were rarely the same. The physical injuries might heal with time, but the mental scars carved deeper. Nightmares plagued their sleep. Guilt, despair, and the weight of watching comrades die lingered like ghosts. The clamor of battle echoed in their minds long after the battlefield was gone. Some knights withdrew from society, unable to rejoin polite company. Others drowned their memories in wine, seeking numbness instead of peace. The armor may have been removed, the sword hung on the wall, but the burden of all they had seen and done clung to them. In a world obsessed with chivalry and virtue, the price of maintaining honor was staggering, and often it claimed far more than a man's health. It claimed his very soul. In the cold hush of pre-dawn, the knight stirred. His sleep had been restless and broken, haunted by the hard chill of stone walls and the biting discomfort of a straw-stuffed mattress spread over rough wooden boards. The air still clung with dampness, and the faint echo of a distant owl marked the only sound outside his drafty chamber. Before the first glow of morning brushed the sky, he was already rising, pulling on a tunic that smelled faintly of yesterday's smoke and the sweat of too many days without wash. His boots, still wet from last night's patrol along a muddy stretch of road, offered no comfort as he stepped into them. There was no softness in a knight's morning routine, no warm bath to ease the muscles, no luxurious robes, no fine breakfast. Only icy water to splash over a face hardened by sun, wind, and endless exposure. His fingers trembled slightly from the cold as he ripped a chunk from a loaf of stale bread, dry and dense, and tore at a piece of salted meat so tough it felt more like leather than food. If the ale hadn't been watered down days ago, he might have found some solace in its bitterness. But he swallowed it anyway, because there was no other option. Then came the ritual of armor, a process not of pride, but endurance. He began with the gambeson, a thick, quilted underlayer, soaked with old sweat and the grime of battles past. It barely cushioned what came next, link by link. The chainmail was draped over his body like a shroud of iron. It pulled at his shoulders, constricted his chest, and rang with a low, metallic hum as he moved. Then the breastplate, spalders, gauntlets, and greaves, each piece an unforgiving slab of metal fastened by squires with bruised knuckles and tired eyes. Every buckle cinched tighter than comfort allowed. By the end, he bore nearly 60 pounds of steel. Standing was effort. Walking, a calculated maneuver. Mounting a horse required help and luck. But there was no room for vanity. The armor was not ornamental. It was the thin wall between life and death. Mid-morning brought no reprieve. Instead, it signaled the start of drills. Swordplay under the sun, repetitive sparring until arms ached and the world blurred. Thudding hooves during riding exercises over and over again until saddle sores and cramps became second nature. The sword's hilt left blisters. Missteps meant bruises or worse. There was no time to coddle wounds. A knight had to be flawless in practice because failure in combat meant graves. Between training, responsibilities. A knight was rarely idle. One might be expected to manage fields, oversee laborers planting or harvesting grain, or ensure taxes were collected and stored. Others guarded noble halls, accompanied dignitaries, or escorted prisoners down perilous roads. There were border skirmishes, sudden uprisings, and patrols through hostile forests where bandits waited in shadow. Whether under blazing sun, icy rain, or the weight of a festering fever, the knight worked on. There was no escape from duty, and wrapped around all of it, training, orders, punishment, and pain, was the invisible chain of chivalry, a code praised in ballads and poems but punishing in reality. It demanded unflinching courage, blind loyalty, unwavering service, and self-denial in every moment. To refuse a duel was cowardice. To question a command was betrayal. Even when justice turned cruel, he was expected to carry it out without flinching. What legends remembered in starlight and song was a far cry from the truth. The knight's life was not a romantic tale of heroism beneath banners. It was fatigue layered on fatigue, a blur of repetition, hardship, and cold iron pressing into skin. Each sunrise brought the same: drills, bruises, orders, silence. Not glory, grind, not grandeur, grit. And each day that passed wasn't a march toward victory, but a slow, deliberate survival through the grinding toll of being what others praised, but never truly understood. In the final stages of a night's grueling day, what followed wasn't triumph or rest. It was a slow, aching descent into painful recovery. After hours spent sealed inside chainmail or heavy plate armor, every muscle screamed in protest from relentless drills, sparring sessions, horseback patrols, and the brutal weight of duty. Removing that armor wasn't a relief, it was another ordeal. A knight couldn't do it alone. Squires or pages had to help, unfastening layers of buckles, lifting away the plates with care. Piece by piece, the shining facade fell away, revealing the raw truth underneath. Sweat-soaked linens clinging to bruised skin, welts and abrasions mapping the body like a second battlefield, and joints inflamed from metal grinding bone with every motion. This unmasking of flesh from steel was no poetic moment. It wasn't symbolic. It was messy, necessary, and painful. Even before a knight could wash, he was reminded of the cost. If he was lucky or well-born, there might be hot water waiting, wooden tubs filled and carried by weary servants. Otherwise, cold cloths had to do the job, scrubbing off dried grime, smeared blood, and the rank odor of fear and fatigue. Every wound, every scrape, every split knuckle or blackened toe was checked in flickering candlelight. Some injuries were minor, others weren't. Cuts were stitched, gashes bound in linen. Salves were rubbed into raw joints and aching muscles, not as luxury, but necessity. Bare minimum care to ensure he could even lift a sword the next day. These were not moments of reflection. These were rituals of survival performed in silence, the kind that comes when words are too heavy and exhaustion drowns all thought. Evening meals, when they arrived, were utilitarian at best. A noble knight might have roasted meat, vegetables stewed beyond recognition, coarse bread, a slice of cheese, and a cup of watered-down wine or ale. But more often, especially during campaign seasons or in remote outposts, food was an afterthought. Stale bread with hard crusts that cracked teeth, watery broth barely warm, porridge filled with lumps, or sinewy meat boiled into flavorless mush. With poor dental health and cracked molars, even eating was a challenge. Chewing hurt. Swallowing was work. The act of eating was mechanical, a grim necessity to keep the body upright, not an act of pleasure or celebration. And even after that meager sustenance, true rest remained out of reach. Duties didn't pause with sunset. There were injured men-at-arms to visit, small disputes among vassals or squires to resolve, messages to deliver, patrols to plan, and horses to tend. A knight lived at the edge of readiness. Rumors of bandits, signs of unrest, or the smallest disturbance could spark a midnight call to arms. In those moments, armor was dragged back on, often still damp from the last battle. Swords were drawn with stiff hands, horses saddled in silence. The call to service was relentless, and no one cared if a knight had slept or eaten. Service didn't pause because the body ached. When and if sleep finally came, it offered little comfort. Castles might provide small stone chambers with straw-stuffed mattresses and rough woolen blankets, barely enough to dull the cold. On campaign, rest was even crueler. Tents pitched in frozen mud, cloaks laid out on damp earth, heads resting on packs with armor stacked close. Often, there was no shelter at all, just the open ground, the chill of wind cutting through cloth, and the weight of gear pressing against the chest. There was no guarantee of sleep, only the hope of enough unconsciousness to push through the next dawn. A whispered prayer might rise in the dark, not from faith, but fear. A final act of hope before the night swallowed everything. Stripped of its glory, Knighthood was a life of constant endurance. Beneath the banners, beneath the oaths, lay the brutal truth: chronic pain, stale food, sleepless nights, endless responsibility, and the ever-present threat of death. There was no romance in the rot of trench foot, the itch of lice beneath armor, or the dull, aching weight of another day survived. The stories passed down speak of bravery, but not of the moments after, when a night lay still, lungs shallow, eyes shut, and heart uncertain whether morning would come. There were no songs for the bruises, no poems for the hunger. Just silence, steel, and the grim realization that everything must be faced again tomorrow, alone, armored, and uncelebrated. The knight's body is a battlefield long after the war ends, and that war often never truly ends. By the time he reaches his mid-30s, if he even makes it that far. His joints are stiff and swollen, his back screams with every step, and old wounds throb like ticking clocks inside his bones. There's no concept of physical therapy, no healing herbs worth a damn, and certainly no time to rest. The body breaks down by degrees. Torn ligaments, cracked ribs, concussions no one even calls that. Pain doesn't fade. It nests inside him, coils around his spine, burrows into his knees, and settles deep in his knuckles. It's the kind of pain you don't speak of, not because you're stoic, but because every other night around you is nursing the same secret torment. It's just part of the life, like rust on steel or the reek of unwashed wool. At night, sleep becomes a ritual of failure, repeated and botched endlessly. Maybe it's the lumpy straw mattress that offers more noise than comfort, full of mites and mildew. Maybe it's the icy wind clawing through the cracks in damp stone walls, or the cold that creeps into your very marrow like a second skin. Or maybe it's the weight of the armor that somehow still feels like it's pressing on your chest, even when it's hanging on the wall. But more than anything, it's the memories, the faces of the fallen, friends and foes alike, the screams of men and horses ripped open by blade or flame, the way a sword feels when it doesn't just clash. It sinks. You try to remind yourself that you are a noble servant of the realm, a protector of the weak, a champion of virtue, but no chivalric verse ever truly drowns out the silence left by those you've killed. You remember their eyes more than their weapons. You remember how quickly blood cools on your hands, how hard it is to scrub it away. Even in peacetime, the castle never stops pulsing with conflict. Tension hides in plain sight, beneath every feast, behind every toast, inside every tightened jaw of every nobleman who looks at you a second too long. You're always just one heartbeat away from an ambush, a whispered betrayal, or another war disguised as ceremony. You'd think all the suffering came with a payoff, legacy, honor, immortality, and song. But no. You're a name scribbled hastily in someone else's scroll, a figure at the edge of a stained glass window. No one notices. A story told once before, it's replaced by another. Castles rise, kings fall, dynasties shift like sand, and knights, no matter how bold, how noble, how loyal, are replaced. Your service is a footnote. The ideals you were told to bleed for, glory, justice, duty, begin to feel like myths spun by cowards in velvet robes, men who never lifted a shield. Honor won't feed your family when your lands are taxed into poverty. It won't keep your children from freezing in winter. It won't mend the bones that healed crooked after the 5th time they broke. It won't stop your hands from shaking or silence the ringing in your ears, left from a mace that glanced your helm 2 decades ago. And when your beard turns white, when your sword hand trembles, and your armor hangs loose where muscle once lived, you finally understand a truth heavier than your heaviest mail. The glory they promised was never meant for you. It was a story designed to keep you riding, killing, and dying for someone else's profit. And in the end, all you are is tired, bone tired, soul tired, forgotten before the echo of your name has even faded from the hall. By the end of a night's life, what remained wasn't the glory sung about in ballads, but a body broken by battle, a spirit worn down by endless campaigns, and a mind hardened by years of relentless war, unyielding duty, and quiet personal loss. Aged knights were rarely the statues of strength and virtue found in stained glass or immortalized in sculpture. Their joints ached from old wounds left to heal in drafty tents. Fingers, once deft with both sword and quill, were now twisted with arthritis and calloused beyond recognition. Scars laced their bodies, each one a relic of ambushes survived, brutal tournaments endured, and grueling campaigns slogged through in the mud of foreign fields. Their hearing dulled from the roar of battle horns, their eyesight faded from squinting across foggy fields and candle-lit scrolls. The war horses they once rode into glory were long gone or grazing in forgotten pastures, their snorts replaced by silence. For some knights their so-called reward was land, an estate to manage, fields to oversee, and peasants to govern. But the work never truly ended. Peace was an illusion more fragile than any sword blade, and even in retirement, many knights found themselves defending their holdings from petty raiders, rival lords, or lawless brigands. Others weren't so fortunate. Instead of titles or wealth, they received a modest pension, just enough to survive, or they relied on the charity of a monastery, living out their days among monks who whispered prayers for past sins. The younger generation, eyes wide with tales of chivalry and heroism, often came seeking wisdom. What they found instead was a quiet, unsentimental realism carved out by decades of toil. Chivalry, the old knight might admit with a shrug, was a pleasant tale for poets to recite beside roaring hearths, but a poor and often deadly guide in the chaos of war. Their armor, once worn with pride and purpose, now hung polished and still above the hearth, a silent monument not to triumph, but to survival. It was less a trophy than a relic, a reminder of the weight they carried day after day through sleet, heat, blood, and sorrow. The lance that had splintered against an enemy's shield, the sword chipped from a desperate clash. These were not simply tools of honor, but instruments of hard, ugly survival. And the noble code they once pledged to uphold? With time and scars came understanding. The code wasn't really about justice or the defense of the innocent. It was a social glue, a mechanism for control, a way to bring order to chaos. Some knights lived long enough to see their entire world shift. Gunpowder replaced steel, the pike wall replaced the cavalry charge, and a new breed of soldier emerged. One that cared more for formations and firearms than banners and bloodlines. New kings rose and redefined warfare not with valor but with mathematics, logistics, and firepower. The battlefield no longer echoed with the thunder of hooves and shouted oaths. The age of the knight faded into memory, replaced by something colder, more impersonal, and brutally efficient. Still, the image of the knight endured, in tapestries, in tales, in the sermons of bards, and in the whispered lessons of history. The knight remained a figure of nobility, bravery, and righteous purpose. The truth, however, was buried beneath layers of steel and sweat, beneath the mud, the blood, the silence, and the regrets. What being a knight truly meant was a life of relentless pain, ceaseless sacrifice, and unwavering service with no promise of glory and no guarantee of reward. And for those who managed to survive long enough to look back on the path they had walked, most understood one hard truth. It was a road few would ever choose to walk again, even if given the chance. They say every man wants to be a knight, until he actually becomes one. The songs don't mention the grime beneath the glamour, the constant toll on the body, or the isolation behind the titles and crests. What the shining armor hides is the daily punishment of life as a knight. Early mornings that started with frigid air and aching limbs, endless drills in full chainmail that wore down even the strongest wills, and the bone-deep fatigue that never quite left you. And after all that came the dread of battle itself, a chaos of blood, noise, and steel where one misstep didn't just mean failure. It meant dying in the mud, nameless and forgotten. By the time a man had clawed his way through childhood training, suffered the humiliations and brutal discipline of squiring, and finally earned the title of Sir, the fantasy had already crumbled. His hands, once smooth with privilege, were thick with calluses from years of gripping reins and sword hilts. His back throbbed constantly from hauling armor that felt more like a cage than protection. His face, weather-beaten, wind-burned, scarred by close calls and clumsy accidents, bore no resemblance to the heroic portraits hung in great halls. And still, the job wasn't done. Then came the feudal obligations, those unrelenting demands to fight for a lord's claim to some distant plot of land, to defend castles not your own, and to bleed in wars sparked by the pride or grudges of men richer than you. Chivalry, the code that was supposed to elevate a knight, often rang hollow. It didn't keep you from being pulled into some nobleman's vendetta, or stationed for months on end in a freezing outpost, living off moldy bread and sour ale while waiting for an enemy who might never come, or worse, one who came without warning. And when the battlefield was quiet, there were tournaments. Romanticized now, they were anything but safe. Jousts were not sport. They were sanctioned brutality in front of cheering crowds. Lances didn't always glance off. Helmets caved in. Bones snapped. Death in the lists was as real as death in war, only with a few more pennants waving overhead. And if you managed to survive the spectacle, bruised and bleeding, you were expected to bow, smile, and do it all again. Even off the field, the pressures didn't ease. A knight had land to oversee, taxes to enforce, and peasants to manage, peasants who both feared and resented you. Court politics were their own kind of war, with whispers, backstabbing, and alliances shifting like sand. One misjudged word to a powerful lord, and you could find your name blackened, your holdings seized, your life's work undone by ink rather than iron. Because if you thought a knight's enemies only waited across the battlefield, you didn't understand the court. So as you settle into sleep tonight, beneath warm blankets and soft pillows, remember this. Beneath the polished steel and tales of valor was a man who bore weight far heavier than armor. A man who rose each morning with aching joints and weary eyes, who bore scars that spoke more of survival than glory, and who, in the quiet hours before dawn, sometimes wished he could go back. Before the sword, before the title, before every choice carried a blade's edge. He wasn't a legend, he was just a man, trying to endure the world he'd sworn to serve. The knight sits alone in the fading light of the great hall, his broad frame silhouetted against the amber glow of the hearth. His armor lies discarded beside him in a dull, sweat-stained heap, a pile of steel and leather that has seen too many battles, too many years. The echoes of a feast still cling faintly to the corners of the room, the scent of roasted meat, the lingering smoke of torches. But the laughter has faded, the music stilled. The servants have retreated into the shadows, leaving only silence, and the weight of memory that presses down on the knight's shoulders like a second set of mail. Once, this hall rang with celebration. Goblets clashed, nobles boasted of heroics they never earned, and songs praised men who barely lifted a blade. The knight remembers sitting quietly through it all, nursing a wound beneath his tunic, each cheer another blow to a spirit already worn thin. He was never one of those storybook knights. No flowing cape, no polished speeches, no battles choreographed for courtly eyes. His path was forged in mud and blood, his sword not a symbol, but a necessity. For weeks, sometimes months, he rode through unfamiliar lands, past villages too small to appear on maps, fight in wars kindled by men who'd never pick up a shield themselves. And now, back in his lord's keep, If this fortress of stone and memory could still be called home, there is no peace, no comfort, only the restless dance of firelight and the ghosts that wait patiently in the dark. His body protests every motion, not from one single injury, but from the cumulative toll of years in battle. His right hand, once so strong, can no longer form a full fist. Not since the morning he caught a mace blow on his gauntlet and the steel warped inward. The bone never healed right. The pain lingers with a dull, constant throb. But even worse than the pain are the memories. He can still see the man he struck down that day, the panic in his eyes, the gasp as his ribs shattered under the knight's blade, the sickening crunch, the sudden silence, and then the blood, hot, red, steaming against the frost-covered earth. No one talks about that. The smell of blood in winter, how it clings to your nostrils, how it follows you long after the snow has melted. Sometimes squires approach him with admiration, eager for tales. They polish his armor, ask about glory, dream of the day they might ride beside him. He says little. What could he say that wouldn't ruin their illusions? They don't understand that being a knight means nights sleeping in armor, the stink of old wounds, the endless days without proper food, the hollow victories. They haven't seen a boy no older than them stumble into a spear because he was too afraid to run. They don't know what it's like to look into a dying man's eyes and feel nothing at all. Because if you feel something, it breaks you. Outside, wind howls across the stone walls. The wooden shutters rattle with the weight of the storm. Still, the knight does not move. His legs are stiff, worn from countless hours in the saddle. His back aches from old injuries never properly tended, but heavier than the body is the soul. Honor, loyalty, courage. These were the pillars of chivalry, or so they claimed. But chivalry doesn't bind a man's wounds. It doesn't shield your conscience from the cries of the wounded. It doesn't pay for the bread on a widow's table. They told him that a knight lives with glory, that his name would be sung, his deeds remembered. But there are no songs for the faces he can't forget, no ballads for the broken, just a quiet fire, fading warmth, and the weight of ghosts who refuse to leave.